The theme for today is speaking up where you live, and the staff person that we're going to be chatting with today is Norm. Norm is he has done a few of these office hours as kind of the not really a guest, but like as kind of the featured staff person. But Norm is almost always also like facilitating the office hours, and so it's fun to kind of like turn the mic around and be able to get to ask him some questions.
The idea of what does it mean to actually speak up where you live, and maybe a related question is like, who does that? And I've often wrestled with this because I grew up and have always been an extrovert and always had sort of an interest in lots of different things. But as I was thinking about it, it's not because I'm an extrovert that I've been drawn to strong towns, but it's as I became aware of the needs in my community, as I began to try to just love the place where I lived, that's what prompted me to then begin speaking up and doing small things, things that anyone can do, not because they drew upon some deep reservoir of extroverted energy that I have access to, but it was just sending in articles to local city councilors in the St. Catharines area, in Ontario, in Vineland, my local community there. Part of it was paying attention to what was going around me in the news, but it was interesting to see that it was still a very solo effort. I engaged politicians, or I would write to the newspaper, but not take that approach of what about other folks? What about connecting with people just where they are? And over time, realizing like as you love your place, that you begin to build up this enthusiasm for the good things that are happening, as well as this growing concern for where the place should be getting to, where which barriers need to be overcome. And so as I think about speaking up where you live, maybe just right out of the gates is that encouragement that you can do this. And I also draw a great deal of inspiration from the folks that I'm meeting in the Strong Towns movement that are doing this. And I think actually a good number of them are on this Zoom call this afternoon, because there's a readiness to take interest in core questions, try to resolve issues, some of that are in appointed offices, elected offices, just working within communities. And so you don't need to be this big, vicarious sort of, extroverted personality in order to actually really take hold of core issues and begin to help with that. And I think if we think of what is Strong Towns doing often in the most effective way is being able to provide people with some resource that helps along the way. Sort of that image in a cooking class where the cooking instructor is able to just say, all right, and here's the tool that you need. And if we can get to that point, I think that as an organization, what Strong Tents will be able to do is then see that many more people to just be encouraged on the one hand, but also equipped to be able to speak up where they live. And so that's what I wanted to kind of frame the whole discussion as we go forward. Again, with that understanding that this is just an element or an aspect of what it takes to do this. There are lots of different approaches, and I want to learn from what other people are doing. But as I was working through the new course that we just released on the Strong Towns Academy called "Mobilizing Your Community to Become a Strong Town," as I was working through the materials and Chuck's lectures and different pieces of that course, I just thought, wow, this really matters, and I became really excited about it. Just to be able to release that as well. And so maybe just a quick comment on that. If you want to access it, there is a fee for those that are able through their workplace or other places to be able to pay for courses that are supplemental learning for them. But we are making this course available free to anyone that is just in their community wanting to benefit from that. And so as much as this office hour session will take up particular aspects of what it means to speak up where you live, that course on mobilizing your community to take action where you live, or where to become a strong town, I should say, is really solid on this. And I think you'll find some really helpful ideas, thoughts. There's exercises that we created for that. And so that would definitely be something to check out as well. Yeah. Thank you, John, for linking that in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what Chris said. Chris from Steinbach said, as an introvert, putting out a really good rant on the local subreddit got me in touch with like-minded people, which eventually led to forming our local conversation. And I thought it'd be interesting if folks also want to put in the chat, like, so what are some of the different ways that they have spoken up? And Norm, maybe I'll just ask you to kind of pick up on this a little bit more. You kind of touched on it. Speaking up doesn't necessarily have to mean a presentation to your city council. There are lots of different ways of kind of being vocal about your hopes for your town, and you're right, the strong town's way of making your town stronger. What are some other ways besides, say, public speaking, that local advocates can speak up?
Certainly, one of the most underrated things that you can do is just to get in touch with a local city councilor and tell them that you're observing what they're doing and that you're appreciative of one thing that you've noticed or two things that you've noticed. Take that as an opportunity to just begin to break the ice. It may lead then to a further opportunity to say, could we meet for coffee? Or do you have a time, if you have a time before one of your public meetings, could we meet up? Doing that can sometimes open up a door, especially if you represent your community in some way, as saying, I'm a parent, or I'm a renter, or I live in a particular neighborhood that's underinvested in, whatever that looks like. Especially if you can bring something of interest to them, I think that is always a great tool. I also think that, like what Chris said of posting a rant, sometimes that can just be what Kerry Westerbeck did in Bothell, Washington, which was
Mhm.
posting to his local Facebook page saying, I don't mind the things that are happening. Like some of the changes being proposed in the new housing being introduced to address a housing crisis, like I'm okay with this. And that was an opportunity for him to then begin to connect with other people as well. I think that sometimes it can be writing in to your local paper. I didn't know how much the letters to the editor still matter. So if you have a local paper, which is a dying commodity at this point, and if they're still accepting letters to the editor, that can be just another little way to say, I'm concerned that our city doesn't have enough money to provide for basic services. And I know that property taxes can't go up, in an unsustainable way. Therefore, I think we need to have serious conversations about these types of things. And sometimes maybe this is a little bit of one more component of it, is that you might stir up a bit of a hornet's nest. And a lot of people want to know what the end image is. What will this look like after all the conversations have taken place? And I think the strong towns approach is, well, part of it is begin that process. You don't have to know, that what the new zoning bylaw is going to look like for you to propose that we change the existing one. It may be that you want to just probe the question, what more should we be doing, or what do we need to stop doing? And that can sometimes be a situation where you read, enough compelling material on the strong town site and you say, hey, like I think I can probably craft a bit of a case here to at least get the conversation started. And I think that's where, I love the fact that we call it a local conversation group. It isn't, we could have called them the local action groups, and there'd be good reason to do that, but it begins prior to that with just that local conversation, encouraging people wherever they live. Even before action, you got to have some conversation. It touches on the ways in which you can humbly figure it out from other people what it is that you might be able to learn from them, as in terms of what they're seeing and experiencing in the place that they live. So yeah, when I think about that, there's also, if you are comfortable in other mediums, I think that when people, for example, create a mural on the side of a street, just adorn something that was mundane and make it beautiful, that is in its own way a version of speaking up to say, like, I have confidence that the place that I live in matters, and I care about this place enough to want to improve it. I would say, even, I touched on this in a podcast I did a while back. My local park, just up the street, we lived in a townhouse complex, and just 4 doors down was this tiny little mini, I call them a developer park, the things that they just have to throw in as a nod to the fact that there should be some public space. And it was pea gravel all underneath the play structure. And so I brought a big shovel, and I took a shovel and I just began, and I heaped all of the pea gravel into a giant mound. And the consequence of that was that all of a sudden my son could climb up it, and he was, thought it was pretty cool. But it was interesting because what I did, it wasn't speaking up, but what I was doing is I took some ownership and responsibility. I kind of probably broke a rule of some sort, but the result was all of a sudden kids were flocking into that park. They were showing up, and I didn't realize there were so many kids. And yeah, they were getting filthy from the all the dirt and all of that stuff that I had unearthed from the gravel. And yet all of a sudden they were using the space in a new way. And so I think, as we think, like, how do we use our communities in new ways? to generate wealth, to encourage connectivity, to help people get together. I think that sometimes it can be even something like that, where you just see like, what if I tried something? What if I adjusted something? What if I took that on? So that is there. I love Eric's comment too, that neighborhood associations are largely up for grabs right now, given the decrease in volunteerism in many cities. Especially if you can convince something like a homeowners association to become a neighborhood association, or even something like a residents association, call it a neighborhood association, sort of broaden the scope of what these associations are for. And a big piece of it is saying, like, how do we make sure that we have a positive agenda for this neighborhood association? Let's cheer on the things that we're excited about, rather than just being formed or continuing to be the people that rail against one issue or another. I love
There are a
that. Yeah,
couple
go
other,
set a new non-NIMBY course for a neighborhood association.
yeah.
That can be as simple as being the person that volunteers to write the newsletter.
Mhm.
And you get to be the person that picks the nice stuff to put in rather than the cranky stuff. There's time for being cranky, but sometimes that's best for a non-public audience.
I'm glad you mentioned Eric's comment because I wanted to highlight it as well, and then a couple other ideas to make sure that these kind of make it into like make it up to onto YouTube for folks who are going to watch later. Greg says that the public has two roles in regard to local government. One is as an owner and the other is as a customer. When approaching the government as an owner, that person needs to speak to the elected board. When offering ideas or concerns as a customer, they should talk to the city manager. That's really helpful advice. And then Christian talks about three ways that that he's spoken up in Richmond. He says he's given a 3-minute speech at a regional planning meeting. He's submitted a 750 word opinion piece to a local newspaper, and he was interviewed on local news about the recent crash analysis studio. All really good ideas. Austin asks a great question here, but I'm actually it's gonna be the next question because I want to kind of lead into it with this other first. Um, the question is that I care about my town and I think the Strong Towns approach can help us become stronger, but I get concerned that people won't listen to me if I speak up. I'm not a planner or an engineer. I don't do this for a living. How can I speak up with confidence if I'm not an expert?
I think the first part of that is to identify what you are an expert in, and that is your personal experience. I would say probably if you are a caregiver for someone, you can probably speak in a lot of ways with a lot of credibility about their experience as well. So that, I frequently reference the fact that my 8-year-old son faces certain barriers to moving around the community or feeling safe or not being able to just play out in the street the way that, the way that our kids used to, and different elements around that. So I think that there's always an innate expertise that we do have. But it does then sort of raise the next question, which is where could you find some of the resources to help you? And so I have found that as I look at the different documents, the different sort of materials that the community puts out there, sometimes I've taken it on myself to just email the person that is listed as the contacted person and just ask, like, can you explain what this is? Because I don't totally understand. And that has been helpful because then it opens up a new line of correspondence and communication. Doing that in that way, rather than being like, I don't think you guys are right. Instead, saying like, I don't totally understand why this is being proposed, gives an opportunity for that staff person, if it's an interaction with a local government, for that staff person to respond, to introduce themselves. They're often part of a project team, and part of their responsibility is to engage with members of the public. And so they may be able to give you that 20, 30 minutes of time. Now, the challenge is that's often during working hours. And so if that corresponds with your own working hours, sometimes that poses a clash. But, on a lunch break or other things like that, to take the time to just say, can you explain, like, what is it that you're, seeking here as you amend the zoning bylaw, or as, why is this imposed on every new project, or what is this new tax, or different elements like that. I think that definitely touches on what you can do. There's also a great level of authenticity that emerges when you're not the planner or the engineer. It's the reason why, I mean, Chuck would say, like, he could have pursued a strategy as a Strong Towns lead to really just worm his way into the engineering and planning professions and try to influence and bring about change that way. The Congress for the New Urbanism, I think, has largely taken this approach, really working within the planning profession. We have seen in the story of Strong Towns that, I mean, the engineering profession has proven a lot more sticky, a lot more difficult to work your way into it. And that's where other groups and Strong Towns early on recognized this. We need people. I can't remember the guy's name. There was somebody that just became really passionate about these things. Maybe Gary was his name. He's from North Dakota or somewhere in the Midwest, and he just became passionate about it. Began running for city council, and before long was bringing in Strong Towns ideas into the place because he was just a person that loved his city and wanted it to do better. And I think that is also with the local conversation group that I lead here in my community. Our biggest asset is that we are not professional. We are just, in a sense, we're almost, well, I shouldn't say we're unassailable because people will find ways to, critique us and stuff. But there is a sense where you create a different type of conversation with the local newspaper. I was on the call with the reporter last week, and she said, "So, like, how did you get into this?" And I was like, "Well, I was a pastor." Like, there's a certain other layer, and she interviewed another member of our group who's a renter, and she's like, I do social media on the side, but I'm caring for two young children. I'm really concerned about the rental crisis. And she was asked, like, well, do you work for any development firms? Like, no, I'm not involved like formally in any of these things. And so there's a sense in which that's actually this leverage that you have. It's a communicative sort of integrity. I don't want to call it a purity test, but there's almost a sense that if you're on the take, that is, if your salary depends upon you advocating for these types of policies, if you're a parking lot pavement removal company and you just conveniently are arguing for the end of parking minimums and repeals of these types of things, people will look askance at that, even around housing development. But if you are just someone who says, I woke up today and I realized like my city's not built for me. If I want to go around on foot, or if I want to, pass through the community in any other way than getting into a vehicle, or I'm just sick and tired of driving 30 minutes to get to anything that I need, that has an added sort of quality and character to it. The other thing is to take note of open opportunities for relationship. And so there's an architect in our community. I don't even know exactly how Jeremy and I connected, but at one point I just said, like, Jeremy, like, can we just go for a walk? And we walked through our village area, and I got to get, in a sense, a quick crash course on what it takes to be an architect, but also how to view the place around me. And that was really transformative. And it's actually one of the reasons why Strong Towns, like Chuck, will often do walking tours. Edward Erford is going to do one at the National Gathering, because of the fact that when you just get out on the street, all of a sudden those observations begin to emerge quite quickly. And so with our local conversation group, actually this in a couple of weeks, on the third Thursday of the month, we're going to host a walking tour just in our community, encourage the community to show up, try to get some city councilors to show up. Now, I know that's a little ways further from the question, but speaking with confidence when you're not an expert, I think, again, going back to what I said at the outset, is identify like what you are an expert in, which is your experience, your story, and then be able to layer on those elements to say, like, if I am also an experience in how I am impacted by this. So if I know that like my favorite store had to close because the bank next door bought it and is demolishing the building that they're in order to provide room for parking, like, I'm an expert in the impact of that. What is the impact on me? What is the impact on those that I care about? What is the impact of a lack of available housing? We could probably, help a lot of planners to figure out, like, there's an urgency. Our group has lit a fire at City Hall, not literally, but metaphorically lit a fire at City Hall because we are not resting until there is a lot more options in terms of housing choices. Right now, 77% of our city is reserved for a type of housing that costs $1.4 million. Well, 1.2 million is the minimum. Upwards, way up of that is what it costs in order to build a single family home. And that's what the majority of our housing land is reserved for. And so we're pointing that out, and we're saying, we need to stop this. We need to turn around that equation so that 33% perhaps was reserved for single detached houses if we needed to have that as an available thing, but that the remainder of the city become a place where there's a lot more options. Yeah, great
Yeah.
question. Love
Yeah,
it.
great question. And then a good follow-up to that is the one from, was that from Austin?
Yeah.
Yeah, from Austin. He says, mine is less of how I have spoken up and how do I speak up as a planner in county government. What is the line for advocacy before it becomes a conflict of interest? Is the line just public education?
It's there's an obligation, I would say, to provide public education, and that might be a component of your job, or it might not yet be a component of your job that you could become the person to take that role and responsibility within the department that you're working in. If there's an interest, sometimes planning staff can be quite just focused on getting through the day, getting through their task. But if there's a member of the team that says, all right, let's figure out new ways or better ways to communicate this to the public, um, pushing for greater transparency, a greater openness, rather than it being sort of a black box, to say, it doesn't serve us well for our planning process to feel like a black box. We need instead for people to have some idea of like what happens at different stages along the way, in part to help underscore the integrity and the reputation of the planning department, so that it isn't just oh, they cooked up these deals in the back rooms, and now the community is just told, would you like to comment on this, but we know that nothing is going to happen, when in fact, if you are aware of what the various levels of public input into the planning process looks like, to be able to say, let's do a better job of explaining that. I think sometimes planning departments get caught unaware of the fact that a lot of the community thinks that they are, on the take, or that they are somehow implicated in bad practices and bad policies. But another element of it is, there's probably certain professional standards that you will need to clear with your employer, identify with a manager. Hey, what do you think? How far can I go on this? What is it that, when we talk about internal discussions, understanding quite clearly, like, what are the elements that are confidential, and what are the elements where it's just not prudent of me to disclose what's going on? And yet, I mean, I talk with planners all the time. I go for walks with them. I try to connect with our local planners, and they're very forthcoming. They would never do a media interview, but one of our senior planners, he and I were out for a walk, and he said, Norm, like, I read this stuff on Strong Towns, like, I think you guys are right. I think that this is really, like, really, really important in terms of how we build our communities. Said, I need that to come down from city council. I need there to be direction from our council before I can begin to proceed on this. He said, I can try to educate, and I do behind closed doors, but we need just like regular folks out there. So Austin, one of the things that you might ask is, who is out there that I can be sort of not feeding information to in sort of like a Watergate sort of style, like dropping hot documents in people's boxes, but there's definitely a lot of room for just trying to figure out, like, who could you inform, who could you guide, who could you give some insight to, in order to help them to navigate a process that can be quite opaque. And then the other piece is reflecting that internally, to say, when we, for example, planning departments use so many acronyms, and there's a lot of jargon, and some of that can be to take a bit of a public advocacy role in saying, can we make this clearer? Can we remove some of the barriers? Within the context of Strong Towns, we've critiqued the fact that modern city planning is a practice that has been largely refined by and crafted for a very modernist version of white progressive male employers, staff and employees and participants, and that expanding that to be much more diverse and much more inclusive requires, in its own way, a lowering of the threshold of what it takes, the bar of entry to enter into those places. And so, being within a planning department, there should be a receptiveness to that. And in time, it can sometimes create its own spillover opportunities to be an educator or an instructor of others. Sometimes being on background with a local reporter, that can be helpful, to just say, hey, if you ever have a question, give me a call. I'll provide you the background information. I won't be able to I won't send you the files, But if you have a question, hey, this project is held up on a technicality, can you explain the technicality to me? That can be really useful. You'll get better local reporting out of it, and you may develop further connections with others. And I would say, like, as a citizen, I would want my local planners to be doing that. I would want them. I mean, they're not just planners, they're the people who sift through the input from the community. And so if the community is providing better input about the impacts of planning decisions, you are in a better place to be able to help your community as a consequence.
Yeah, it reminds me of things that we've talked about related to the Community Action Lab, where you really so with Community Action Lab, which we're doing in 4 cities right now, you have the leadership team, you have the action team, and then there are the citizens, probably in the form of local conversations. And the citizens, as Christian said, like so well in the chat earlier, like citizens are the experts in their community. Like the residents are the experts. And like there's a role for city staff, there's a role for city leaders, and there's obviously a role for local advocates as well, both to put pressure on the changes that need to be made, but also to provide cover for city staff who are doing good things that deserve to be celebrated, to kind of protect them from some of the pressures they may be feeling from elsewhere. You really have to have all of those components working in a community to, or ideally, I should say, you have all of those components working in a community.
Yeah.
In fact, so related to the local conversations, the next question is it's kind of more of a comment though. I'd be interested to hear your response, Norm. I, they say maybe not a strong towns problem, just a barrier I'm experiencing. My community has a local conversation, but I'm struggling still to get involved. I'm shy about public speaking and want to join the conversation, but I'm finding it difficult. I'm much more comfortable being a bureaucrat in my professional life than a gadfly in my private life. By the way, I don't know who wrote that, but that's just good writing. That's just good writing. So, um, so what would you say to this person?
I think that one, it's really important to recognize just your own style, your own sense. What is it that extends your comfort zone? What is it that is so difficult about public speaking? Because I've been a member of the Strong Towns Toastmasters Club now for over a year. And I want to plug that because Toastmasters is, I think, part of the answer to it, which is a way to, on a weekly basis, try out different things as a public speaker. There's opportunities within our weekly meetings to be able to give a speech or to evaluate other people's speeches, to be able to offer comments. Hey, you could consider doing these types of things. And I find that is really helpful. I've been a Toastmaster off and on for, I think, almost 14 years, and I'm still working at it. And I was part of a club at Vancouver City Hall, and people found out that I was a pastor, and they're like, "What? Why are you doing Toastmasters?" Because I always want to keep improving. Now, if there's an element of Susan Cain's book on called Quiet, the Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, she has some great uh, guidance for those that feel or are more introverted. And she would distinguish between those who are introverted and those that struggle with shyness. And if there's a deep sense that the shyness limits a lot of your engagements and things like that in a public setting, where if someone asks you a question and you find it challenging in the moment to be able to respond, that may be something where you work at that with something like a Toastmasters Club or other things like that. But in general, to be introverted is still to have lots of opportunities to speak in at the right moment or change the medium, do so by means of writing or about writing in or contacting people in small group settings, doing different types of things like that. But the other thing is, and I take a lot of comfort from the fact that the Strong Towns critique is that something's gone awfully wrong for 80 years. And the suburban experiment has been sort of running amok. And this experiment has been an unqualified failure in so many different ways, which I guess is my way of saying that it is somewhat qualified because we have experienced some benefits, but largely we're seeing great threats. To undo 80 years of trouble is going to take maybe even 80 more years. And so there's definitely a need to be able to take a long view of it. And that's where I think reducing some of the pressure helps as well. I've had it where I've spoken at public meetings and thought, oh, that was kind of a dud. Be like, all right, but I'll be back for the next one. Or, I'll do it again. I remember an irony for me as being a fairly accomplished speaker was I was walking into City Hall in Vancouver in order to start the Toastmasters Club meeting. And I think I was scheduled to do a 20-minute speech on that particular occasion. But a reporter on the way, as I was walking up, a reporter was doing sort of like people on the street sort of interviews. And I was like, oh, I got this. And I totally fluffed it. Like I hope it didn't make it to air because it was terrible. She asked me the question, immediately froze. I had it where I did the Strong Towns podcast with Rachel Quednow a little while ago. And I fluffed my opening lines like 3 times where she was like, all right, tell me about yourself and what brought you to Strong Towns, and like froze, like deer in the headlights. Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. And so I think that that is maybe an element of it, is how to speak up in your community, is just being okay with the moments where you realize like, I have this like certain degree of likelihood of not making it, like not hitting my marks, not getting in the comments that you want to get in, and that the only way to push through that is to persist and to try again, to take further opportunities, to get into that. And so I think that it is something that can be practiced, something that can be tried. I like the comment in the chat that public speakers also benefit when they know that they have allies
Mhm.
in the audience.
Yes.
And so
Mhm.
that can be that situation where you attend, and you attend in some way, making another person know that you're there to support them, or even just something like, you don't have to be not a a loud amen when somebody makes a great point, but just participating in the process by supporting what is being said, I think can make a big difference as well.
I'm going to shift the questions a little bit towards from maybe even like literally speaking up to more towards taking action in other ways. But before I do that, I just want to mention, I don't think it's a secret, Norm, but if it is, the secret's going to be out. Like Norm has been working on putting together the like a strong creators program, and it's like we want to help folks who want to speak out in a variety of ways. Certainly public speaking, but also there are folks who run their own local podcasts, like the Allendale Strong podcast is a great local podcast. We have folks who want to start their own YouTube channels to talk about these issues, similar to Not Just Bikes and others. We have folks who want to write, blog about this. We have even folks who are doing this on social media, people who are performing and like writing and performing music related to these ideas. And so there are so many ways to speak out. Like we are working on this program, Norm is working on this program that is going to um, like really try to support those folks as they do create around these topics. So be on the lookout for that. There's going to be a session related to this at the National Gathering where we have who's going to be in that session. Like there's some Tiffany Owens I know is going to be in there. Who else?
The City Nerd guy that does the City Nerd YouTube videos,
Okay.
Alan Fisher, another YouTuber about urbanism. There's somebody else, can't remember, and then Mike Pasternak, our video creator. And yeah, we're going to be launching at the National Gathering the local creator program, and I'm really wanting to focus that idea that there is, I think, two things that we can offer as sort of the organization, where we can try to provide some materials on like how to do it, how to equip yourself, just from a layperson audience perspective, to say, what could you do to assist your community by pointing out things, by highlighting what's going on, by just talking about it or writing about it or speaking about it, whatever that looks like. And then the other part will be the like visibility side of it. That's going to take more time. Much like we saw with local conversation, the local conversation program emerged because we recognize people are already doing this. Let's figure out how do we help them and how do we make it easier for people to find them. And that's going to be the exact same sort of model that we're going to take with the local creator program. How do we help people? And that can be, some people come in at grade 1. Some people come in at, a master's degree already in terms of content creation. And so we want to acknowledge that for some folks, like setting up a website is the hard part. For other folks, they're like, oh, I've set up, hundreds of websites, but I have no idea how to like, package my content in a way that's consistent with Strong Town. So we're going to try to provide some helpful resources on that. I interviewed Chuck about his writing process, and learning about what his process looked like was quite helpful for me. But then another component of it is trying to figure out ways to really broaden the reach of our local writers. Because what we have observed is that when people are writing or speaking about their local stuff, my brother-in-law runs the site Dear Winnipeg and writes about Strongtown's issues, but it's all about the city of Winnipeg. He calls his blog a fun blog about municipal finances and infrastructure, which is, I mean, it's fantastic. And what it has done is it has created great content from the Strongtown site. We run it in not because it's from Winnipeg, but because it's about a local place with an application to so many other places. And so what we were noticing is that a local conversation group often was having the conversations that we really wanted to take place within a community. And similarly, what we were seeing is the local creators were actually creating stuff that was super compelling and applicable to even, in a sense, a national audience, because the Strong Towns approach is none of this is actually national, like, or virtually none of it. It's all like at the local level. It's all got to be implemented from the bottom up. It all has to take that approach. And even when we advocate, if there is a responsibility that a state government has, most of the time it's just to get out of the way, like to allow municipalities to sort things out, and at key moments to break the logjam where NIMBYism and other things like that have just stacked up all of these barriers, and to just come along and clear that away, as we've seen in Oregon. California has done this, Montana's done this now, more and more places that are taking that approach. The BC government reached out, and the provincial advisor to the Minister of Housing was asking, hey, what would the Strong Towns approach be on these questions? Because we know that we should do something about housing. What could we do while still respecting local communities? And he wanted to know that. And I said, it has to be from the local ecosystem. That's where we see these little seeds of new change that will bring about the lasting change that we need to see in our communities. And so I got a little further away from the local creator program, but I'm really excited to see what will happen, because it kind of follows a two-fold or two-stage approach, where with local conversations, we saw that they were happening organically, just people meeting at coffee shops, doing things. And then we began to support that work. And now we have several hundred that are in the pipeline, several hundred that are currently running. It's like blossomed. And I have high expectations that we'll see something very similar. And this might be maybe one encouragement as well, is that if you speak to your local council, consider, can you duplicate that work for a letter to the editor? Can you take a portion of it and post it to your website, or do it the other way? Write a blog post, share some of that in your letter to the council, and send some of it out as a letter to the editor, and then take like the little juicy bit and post it to Twitter. That's 4 fruits out of 1 root. That might be the way in which you can find, there was a question that came up like, hey, I'm a parent, like I don't know how to find time for this. Sometimes it's just work on the big piece, pull those pieces together, and then get it out there. Another challenge, or another thing, is iterate at it, practice at it, figure out ways that definitely makes a difference as well.
Why don't we talk about that question that came in? As a parent, I find I don't have the time I would like to spend engaging on these issues, and more tips on low time commitment actions would be helpful.
Yeah. Low time commitment options include things like signing up for your community newsletters. So if there's a neighborhood association, submit your email address and just be informed. I think tracking those things is one of the ways that you might every so often be like, oh, I could probably attend that, or oh, I could probably participate in that. Another thing to do is to think like, what if I set a very manageable sort of goal for myself? Every 2 months, I want to have written at least 1 email to a local city councilor. Those things can sometimes begin to spiral, where they respond and then they ask, could we get you to be involved in something? And I say, well, I'm not available to be involved right now, but I can tell you that these ought to be the types of considerations you should have in mind. If there's a cycling strategy, I had this with our local, we have well, I don't want to disparage them. They're the men in Lycra, and they love to ride around town on their street bikes or their racing bikes. And I joined the local committee of the biking advocacy group here, in part because I said, I don't ever like, my bike is a Dutch bike. It's slow, it's clunky, but I need you to advocate for my son. I need you to just, and so I don't get a chance to go to their meetings very often, but knowing like, and I mean, these were people that were bike advocates for quite a long time, but they'd never heard the idea of like, you need bike routes that are accessible to 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds. And I just said, like, that's what, when we talk about all ages and all abilities, that's what we need to be focused on. And that began to move the needle a little bit in the way that they were advocating for the cycling strategies and different things like that. Even just raising the question, like, when you call something a bike lane as a bike advocacy group, is it actually a proper bike lane, or is it just something that appeals to you, which is, you know, a place that you can go quickly on your tour to Delta as you pass through um, mammals to advocate for, oh, middle-aged men in lycra. Yeah. That's awesome.
That's good.
So
Well, for
yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. The next question I want to preface with a comment that Greg made earlier. He said that he listened to the newest Strong Towns podcast this morning and found it very enlightening. That's the one with Ian Lockwood, I think. And Greg says, while listening on the road, I drove to 2 cities that have state highway as a main street. And I was reminded that oftentimes the state adds a huge layer to being able to make a difference in road design and acting means to slow traffic. And that connects to a question that came in earlier. The question says, my biggest struggle is figuring out how to implement small, quick changes in an already built up location with many overlapping jurisdiction. Anything that falls under state control is particularly difficult to work with. Do you have any guidance for how to deal with that? It would be helpful.
Yeah. So this is going to be unsatisfying probably, but I would say is ignore the state controlled elements until the changes that you've seen in your community become unignorable to the state. And what I mean by that, and this came up in a question that I feel that last week when I was in Michigan, is someone was asking, we have our commercial corridor, but it's a state highway. There just doesn't seem to be any hope, and all of the buildings are built around the speed and scale of an automobile. And so, how do we create a core? And one of the recommendations that I had is, and this person was a planner in their community. I said, can you find those places that are perpendicular? Find where you can create, if this is your main road running right through, find one node or 2 nodes where you begin to create those streets that have only one reason to cross, or one point where they need to cross, but begin to thicken out by changing the zoning code to allow some retail on those places. Oftentimes we have one lane of commercial or one corridor of commercial, and immediately outside of that, there's nothing else allowed except for residential. What if you just say, all right, we're going to target one corridor or 2 corridors that run perpendicular to it, and those are going to become the seeds for our new smaller or lower speed, small scale types of retail sectors. And ideally, what you can do is you almost ignore the corridor and give up on it, in the sense of saying, like, I'm not going to trouble myself with this corridor for 10 years. And instead say, what if we can create 2 of these perpendicular sort of sections, these nodes, and ideally connect, if it's a bit of a grid system, connect sort of around it, so that way you create this rectangle of that would be walkable, that would be vibrant, that would be spilling out and bleeding into the community in the most wonderful of ways. And then you would raise the priority that there would be genuinely plenty of cross street traffic at that one intersection, where you can convince at that point all of your city leaders, we're not asking you to lower the speed limit on the whole corridor. Because sometimes, I mean, there are corridors where, you know, people have lived with 70, you know, or sorry, I have to convert to American funny numbers, 40 miles per hour. That's been the standard for so long that it's really difficult to bring that number. Well, 50. I was driving in Michigan and it was like 50 miles an hour right through like people's neighborhoods. I thought this is insane. But the result is, if you can identify that corridor and begin to find ways to really slow it down. Because if someone is passing right through your town, they won't even be bothered by the fact that if they take a right turn or a left turn onto your new commercial areas, that they have to, slow right down, that you have squared off the edges of the street. So that way you have to really navigate that. You have to slow right down and then come to, make your way into a place that is so clearly visibly marked as a pedestrian friendly area. And I fear a lot of local advocates try to fix the Strode, and they just are like tilting at windmills because they're trying to figure out, like, how do we slow traffic on a 6-lane thoroughfare? And I know it's challenging, and you, at some point, we don't want to just give up on everything that is difficult, but they seem to be very intractable problems. And so ideally you can get to the point where you have changed enough on these cores in our communities where that change becomes unignorable to the state authorities. Now, they are very good at ignoring things. And I say that with some, respect for the fact that it's a big role. There's a lot of things that are under their responsibility. But when they realize, oh, this community is consistently doing some really, really exciting things, and the thing that they keep asking for is one intersection to be improved, not all of them, but just one, that might be one of the ways that we begin to filter in the type of change that we need to see in our community.
I think Strong Towns is great. I think the mission is exactly what we need to make planning choices, not based on utopian pie in the sky thinking, but on rational, pragmatic, and consensus winning principles. I'd like to see Strong Towns run a free City Budgets 101 course. Someday I'd like to run for office, but I don't think I have the background to do it recently. Just listening to all the jargon at planning council meetings and at city council, it's mind-boggling. Any advice? Do we have anything like a City Budgets 101 in the works, or a resource that we can already share?
So we don't yet. And part of the reason why I grabbed this question and said we need to make sure that we get this in is I think that we really should. One of the challenges is ensuring that it's applicable in enough places, because budgeting practices can shift, can change. But it does touch on the fact that, well, here, before I touch on one last piece, I do want to highlight the work that Tiffany Owens-Reed is doing
Yeah.
with her Cities Decoded site. So this is very complementary to what Strong Towns is doing. Tiffany is extremely gifted and skilled. And yeah, she is definitely taking a lot of core concepts about relating to your community and trying to decode them and make them accessible to people. And so I did want to give that a shout out. But another key part of it is that we are looking, I think, this summer, potentially into the fall, to launch a program related to our transparent local accounting project. And so our core campaign to ensure transparent local accounting includes a bunch of different components. One of the elements is trying to change the generally accepted standard practice, or what is GASB? Generally accepted standards for budgeting, I think is what it is, for municipalities, GASB, trying to get them, for example, to recategorize things that they currently list as assets, to say, like, there needs to be a much deeper understanding that the vast majority of things that the community is responsible for are liabilities, and therefore shouldn't be used to prop up balance sheets and things like that. So that would be a part of the program, is helping people to decode their budget. We've talked about like a budget decoder ring, where you just like pour in your city's budget, and then out comes this like smoothie with like a description of all of the different details within it. That's quite challenging. It's going to be a big lift. There's a technological side to it. So if you know a programmer that's really good at sort of doing user interface stuff, where they can put something in and get a clearer sort of dashboard style project out of it, that is something that we are definitely pursuing. We're going to be going out and looking for funders to try to help us to get to that point, kind of to do what we've done with the Crash Analysis Studio for Safe Streets, trying to do something very deliberately. And I don't think we've talked about this, so you're hearing it here first, but that just to come up with something like a budget decoder ring to help with that. But I think that the general point of doing budgets 101, I think that is definitely something that we should be doing. And if anyone has some suggestions on resources that exist currently that we could draw upon, that would be hugely helpful as well. So definitely do get in touch if there's anything more. But maybe John, I want to just end on the question of, should you speak up in your community? And the answer is yes, but do it in your way.
Yeah.
Do it in a way that you feel is sustainable, touching on the idea of like, there's probably times where you have more time for it, other times where you don't. I would also encourage and beg you to find ways to do so in a way that's inclusive. Inclusive in the broadest sense of listening for other people's stories and encouraging them to share those stories as well. I would also encourage you to remember, or no, let me say, speak from personal experience to say that it is very rewarding. One of the most rewarding elements of being a local conversation leader for me has been working with young people that I've written letters of reference for to help them get jobs as planners, to help them get summer internships, to sort of pay it forward, because people did that for me. And I think that is a way in which we can definitely provide a lot of benefit to the folks within the community. If you are, I mean, I'm almost 40, so I'm on the older side of the spectrum now. If you are like me on the older side of the spectrum, to be able to join some of the younger whippersnappers, what I have found is that they are the ones that are really moving forward. And sometimes they need a little bit of like a tempering of their enthusiasm, but at the same time, it does connect you to a new wave of energy. Certainly around the strong towns discussions, there's a lot of receptivity to it. And I think it's a good antidote to some of the hopelessness that we can at times feel, where we say, like, is nothing good going to come from this place? And the reality is, I mean, what Chuck has said really resonates with me. Like, if you love your place, it will love you back. And I have experienced that. I see that increasingly in the stories that I hear. And that's been really, really beneficial. So